MA 19201 Engineering Mechanics. Welcome you all to the online class. Unit 5 Friction, Module 1. Here we are going to learn about friction and its types, limiting friction, coefficient of friction, and angle of friction, Coulomb's law of dry friction, impending motion, and angle of repose. What is friction? Friction is a force between two surfaces that are sliding or trying to slide across one another. For example, when you try to push a toy car along a floor, the toy car motion is this side, so the friction happens in the opposite direction. So friction always works in the direction opposite from the direction of the object that is moving or trying to move. It always slows a moving object down. A simple definition of friction: the opposing force which acts in the opposite direction of the movement of the upper body is called as friction force, or simply friction. So a block is here, the block is pushed by applying some force, therefore the block tends to move this side. So the motion is opposed by the friction. Free body diagram: every block will be having its own self weight. The self weight is balanced by a normal reaction. If you apply force in this direction, the applied force is balanced by the friction force. Types of friction: generally we classify the friction into two categories. One is static friction and another is dynamic friction. Static friction: when the body is in a rest condition, then the friction force exerted by the body is called as static friction. So this is the example of a static friction, that is a book resting on a desk or a potted plant sitting on a sidewalk. Dynamic friction: when the body is in motion condition, then the friction force exerted by the body is called as dynamic friction. The dynamic friction is also classified into three categories. One is sliding friction, number 2 rolling friction, number 3 pivot friction. Sliding friction: when a body slides over another body, then the friction force exerted by the body is called as sliding friction. Rolling friction: a body which has balls or rollers rolls on another body, then the friction force exerted by the second body on the first body is called rolling friction. Pivot friction: the friction force experienced by a body due to the motion of rotation, as in case of footstep bearings. An example of sliding friction: writing pencil point and paper. Or another example is combining your hair surface on comb and strands of hair. Rolling friction: an example, that is riding a bike, so tires and ground will have a rolling friction. Or bowling ball lane. Some other types of friction: dry friction: friction between two unlubricated or dry surface is known as dry friction. A lubricated friction: friction between two lubricated surfaces is called as lubricated friction. And the lubricated friction is classified into two categories. One is greasy friction and another one is fluid friction. When there is a very thin layer of lubrication between the surfaces is called as greasy friction. When we introduce a thick layer of lubricant between two moving surfaces, it is called as a fluid friction. Fluid friction: the force that tries to slows down the object when they move through a liquid or gas. It is also known as a drag or air resistance. So this is the example: while a person moving in water, there will be some resistance. That resistance or opposing force is called as fluid friction. Limiting friction: the maximum frictional force that can be developed at the constant surface when the body is just on the point of moving is called limiting friction. A block will be balanced when there is an equal force. Applied force is equal to friction force. When applied force is more, there will be some limiting friction, so the object tends to move. Angle of friction, the angle between a normal and the resultant force is called as angle of friction. This is the normal and this is the resultant, so the angle between these two is called as angle of friction. Coefficient of friction, the ratio of limiting friction and normal reaction is called as coefficient of friction. Simple expression, that is mu is equal to F by N. Simply F is equal to mu into N. F is the frictional force, N is the normal reaction, mu is the coefficient of friction. Angle of repose, with increase in angle of the inclined surface, the maximum angle at which the body starts sliding down is called as angle of friction. So, you look at the figure, the block is placed on an inclination. So, the angle is pi. If you increase the angle from 0 to higher inclination, therefore the block will tends to slide down due to the inclination. So, that angle is called angle of repose. Loss of friction, loss of static friction. The friction force always acts in the direction opposite to that in which the body tends to move. The magnitude of friction force is equal to the external force, that is F is equal to P. The ratio of limiting friction and normal friction is constant, that is mu is equal to F divided by N. The friction force does not depend upon the area of contact between the two surfaces. The friction force depends upon the roughness of the surfaces. Law of dynamic friction, the friction force always acts in a direction opposite that in which the body is moving. The ratio of limiting friction F and the normal reaction N is constant and it is known as coefficient of friction mu. For moderate speeds, the friction force remains constant but it decreases slightly with the increase of speed. Impending motion, the state of motion of a body which is just about to move or slide down is called as impending motion. The point where the object tends to slide down is called as impending motion. When the maximum force is attained and if the applied force exceeds the limiting friction, then the body starts to slide down. So this state is called as impending motion. Thank you.